I'd like to welcome everybody to the second GenSpec USA webinar, where we're very pleased to have Dr. Kris Kaliebe and Natalya Murakhver of Restore Childhood to talk about their urgent conversation toolkit about gender. I was lucky to spend some time with Natalya at the ROGD Awareness conference, and I've just been really looking forward to this. Just so you know, Christopher is professor of psychiatry at the University of South Florida in Tampa. He is a board-certified psychiatrist. He is a child and adolescent psychiatry and forensic psychiatry and distinguished fellow at the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. And Natalya is the co-founder of Restore Childhood, which is a national nonprofit which was founded to protect children from government overreach. So welcome, you guys. I just thought it might be good to start out by talking a little bit about how you decided to write the gender toolkit. How did you start Restore Childhood, and what makes you think this is such an urgent conversation?
Well, thank you for having us, and thanks for that question. I started Restore Childhood with my partner Dana Hensley about 2 years ago, just as we were getting over the COVID mandates and kids were still being masked in school. We had just worked on another toolkit to help mask mandates fall away. It was called Urgency of Normal. And that was also something that was very scientifically and evidence-based. We had coalesced a group of doctors from around the country to present the evidence on, or the lack of evidence for, school mask mandates and pretty much all mitigations, and the preponderance of evidence for getting kids back to normal in person and socializing and with their teachers as rapidly as possible because of the mental health pandemic. I mean, it was coming, it was here. It's gotten worse. And this toolkit is pretty much an heir to that one. We believe that parents have many urgent conversations to be having, both in the home and with their teachers and with other parents at the schoolyard, because parents for a long time, myself included, have been very reliant on our schools and our regulatory agencies to be making decisions for our children. And during COVID, we realized that maybe that wasn't such a great idea, and maybe they didn't have our children's best interests at heart, and maybe the experts were us. So this is a toolkit that we worked on for about a year with a group of parents, mostly from the left, but really across the aisle. I'm a New York City still registered Democrat, so it's really important to bring together a coalition of diverse voices. And with Kris and several other doctors, including pediatricians and child and adolescent psychiatrists, because the urgent conversation last year, this year, and I think into the foreseeable future is going to be, how do we protect our children from gender ideology and from irreversible damage?
What about you, Kris? Was there something that drew you to the issue?
Well, I just as a practicing psychiatrist and doing mostly child, I've told this story many times, but you can't help but notice when something like this comes on. I started medical school in 1995. I was a busy practitioner. I was at LSU Medical School, and as a faculty, we were talking about cases. We talked about all sorts of cases. Saw so many people, and never once between 1995 starting medical school, my 3 different residencies, my first 11 years of practice, not once did I have a patient expressing gender dysphoria. Now I can go to a clinic and I supervise resident clinics, and on a number of occasions with the residence patients, we've had 3 gender dysphoric patients within one clinic. I mean, just imagine that over 25 years or over 20 years of practicing not seeing this at all, and now you can go to a clinic and see 3 patients that are uncomfortable with their body. You know, it just seems somehow through a combination of factors, we are now creating distress in children that didn't really used to be there before. And, you know, there always were difficult issues with girlish boys and boyish girls. There always were kids who had distress related to their body, but it's being conceptualized and talked about and evolving differently in kids today in a way that I think is just not healthy. And as I looked into what was going on, I was really shocked that people were moving towards a sort of agreement with the child philosophy. They call it affirming the child. And it was just contrary to everything that we had always been doing in psychotherapy and mental health. It's a totally different approach than everything I was always taught, everything I had seen working. And I became concerned that where this came from. And I looked around, saw it didn't really come from something that made a lot of sense. And, you know, over time, this has been my obligation to now get in the middle of it and speak up for high quality, you know, mental health care. And you have to take it sort of out of the clinic now too, because I can have an effect on individual patients. But when this is such a mass phenomenon, people, you know, really should know the facts on it.
Right. I thought it was really striking that you start with the school to clinic pipeline. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, because, like you say, this is very new. It's ubiquitous. So, where is it coming from, and what do the schools have to do with it?
Well, I think Natalya will have a lot to say too, but I'll start with, we are clearly introducing a number of theories about human beings into schools now that weren't being introduced before. I don't think anywhere in human history we've ever been telling kids that they should be choosing pronouns, or that there's, you know, unlimited number of genders and you can kind of choose what you want to be. I mean, it just all seems
Oops, I think we lost Kris.
Yeah, I think he froze for a second.
Am I frozen?
Yeah, you're back.
You're back.
For whatever reason, and you know, so it seems like within schools, they, and I believe it's mostly coming out of a desire to help, but it seems like there's a very misguided wave of ideology that's introduced into school, and I think it's contributing to kids' problems. So we kind of have to talk about schools, and we have to talk about how, since this is one of their primary places of socialization, they're now having these problems. It is leading to kids becoming medicalized or having clinics. So we kind of have to talk about what's going on in schools.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You know, I think Kris gives the whole system more benefit of the doubt than I do. I do think that it's coming from the top down. Just like when we fought to reopen schools, we were very clear that the teachers were not the enemy. The teachers were our friends and our allies. The teachers union and those big organizations, those, activist organizations that have been pouring money into creating curriculum that's absolutely toxic to our children and likely to our teachers. I mean, who wants to put a teacher in the position to be asking a child for a secret and building walls between a child and the parents that you are supposed to be interacting with and using your relationship with to help that child thrive? I don't think any teacher goes into this with that idea, just like no teachers went into teaching to be stuck at home behind a Zoom screen with their kids miles away in a classroom with a mask on, looking into a screen, or at home, isolated. So I think that, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, that the big organizations that are pushing their views and agendas onto everyone and creating this tension between the teachers and the administrators. I mean, I made friends with our former principal. She had in elementary school, she had no desire to keep secrets or have her teachers keep secrets from parents. And yet I had to tell her, hey, this is coming down the pipeline And at some point, you're not going to have a say or you're not going to have a job. So I think, I think that's something that I do want to stress. Like, I think that I do feel sorry for teachers who are stuck in this as well.
And I think that's true. I mean, I hear from people who I would call normie teachers, who have been, kind of running from pillar to post, and then this gender stuff is kind of foisted on them, and then every once in a while, one of the teachers starts to look more closely and says, "Oh my God, what is this?" And I mean, I get the sense that teachers are already overloaded, and then you have this as well on top of it. So I suspect there's an audience amongst teachers for the toolkit as well. The other thing I thought would be worth mentioning is that, I mean, the way that the toolkit talks about it is in terms of how the schools prepare the way for medicalization. But we actually have some schools that have clinics within them where they can refer children directly. And that seems a bit less innocent to me.
Yeah, community schools.
Yeah.
If you look at every tweet, every message from the American Federation of Teachers, the National Education Association, they are pushing those community schools. They want every school to be a community school. And it always sounds so innocuous and so great. Who doesn't want a community school? Well, guess what? The teachers' unions actually don't care about community schools in terms of like what we think of as community schools, because they're pushing for smaller class sizes in New York City as enrollment continues to drop. And parents are pushing to keep schools at capacity in their neighborhood so that their kids don't have to travel, an hour in every direction to like get to a school. That's a community school, a school in your community. This community school thing is really a monster, and actually something that Restore Childhood has been looking at a lot and thinking about how to approach, because it becomes, the institution becomes the entire pathway, the school to clinic pipeline, that it's all inside that building. And there are federal laws that are being passed and state laws as well that are taking that permission away from parents and putting it in the children's hands. And suddenly that child is in the school. Imagine a social worker is seeing the child, sees distress, suggests solutions to that problem. And what happens when they go into the medical office? And what does the parent know that by the time they find out, it's already too late?
That's right.
I think everyone could see a desire to bring healthcare to children in a setting where they already are. And that would be the positive justification of putting medical clinics in schools. However, at this point in history, considering what is going on with the really dysfunctional approach of the medical establishment, you are now kind of shoving that down the throat of the families, often without them really even knowing that you're now bringing this ideology into schools. So, where you should have something that maybe could help, but you'd have to do it carefully and work out, proper medical care and how you could maybe do some of that at a school. We're now in a situation of a complete, overtake of control of what's going on in schools. Because if you have a clinic there, that's affirmative. If you have teachers that are forced to be affirmative, if you have staff that's forced to be affirmative, there is no reasonable adult there who's going to be like, hey, this is all doesn't make any sense. It's going to make it really hard for proper policy in the school. And the whole strange thing is this is all built on this idea that there's some evidence that affirming children is great for them and it's going to be great for their mental health. And that's just that's a theory not backed up by evidence. So we're proceeding further and further down this pathway with no evidence. And I think you can pretty easily see how affirming a child in the opposite sex of what they are can cause harm to them, that this is not a great policy and can lead to them being more destabilized. Plus, the other thing that's really crazy is schools should just stand for truth, because I thought that was an important thing about schools, is that that's a place where the truth would be important. But apparently the truth is less important in schools than I thought it was, because it seems like schools are willing to throw the truth aside, certainly in this case, for whatever for whatever ideology that is really supporting bringing this in.
Mm-hmm. I wonder. Before we started, I was telling Kris and Natalya about how I arrived at the dentist's office today with my Toolkit postcards, because I knew that the women working there had girls who were 9 and 10, and the response that I kind of got was, "Oh, I've known about this, but I didn't, I knew about it, but I wasn't sure that, where to find out about it, what information was available." And so it was really nice, because I think one of the nice things about the Toolkit is that you have all of the scientific information, all of the data. It's also a living document, because you'll notice there are little QR codes on it, and you can use those to get a new version of the Toolkit as things emerge. And so that was really interesting, because they just seemed so grateful, because this seems to be something that people are very uncomfortable about talking about. But I was wondering, so the girls I had in mind here were 9 and 10. What age do you think that parents should start to look out for this sort of thing in schools?
Well, if I'm answering the question, I think it's before school, actually. I think at the GenSpec conference, you heard Sean Theory talking about this little, bison in a show on Netflix that was targeting very young children, like 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. And I was aware of this show, actually, because a friend had pointed out to me how just shocking it was that this non-binary purple bison, who ended up becoming the leader of the herd, was introduced in the middle of season 4. So parents who had watched this show with their kids, very young kids, preschoolers, up until season 4, were like, "Oh yeah, nothing to see here, need to take a shower, turn this on and go, go." They may not even know that this is happening if they miss that moment. So in my opinion, all of this, if media and schools and activists can introduce these concepts to children as young as 4, we should take the lead and go first. And so I think parents should gently introduce these concepts, show these children, show their very young children these images, and start to kind of gently make them aware and inoculate them, so that when they encounter them in the wild, it's not the first time, and, the glitz and the glamour is gone. And then they can kind of come back and say, "Hey, Mommy, remember you told me about that non-binary bison or whatever? I just saw it at a show. Or we just read I Am Jazz. Can we talk about it?" Tell those kids, no matter, 4, 5, 6, 7, that you know about this, that you're educated, you're confident, you're fluent, and that this is a conversation that should be had in the home to contextualize, because otherwise they see all these images, they hear these stories, and there's no context. And so the activist provides the context.
Yeah, I will add also that I don't see any reason why, with younger kids especially, that you would not be able to have a conversation that there are boys and there are girls, and they're different sexes, and they don't change back and forth, and this is the way we're made. And if someone at your school or in the playground or wherever says anything different or has different ideas, just let me know and we could talk about it. And, understand that this is just a fact. And sometimes people use language or get it confused or whatever. And if anyone brings any of that to you, let me know who it was and let's talk about it. But you'll notice as you look around that reality is there. And, so I think introducing proactively the idea that there are two sexes and there's a sex binary, kids get that anyway. There was a book about 25 years ago by Eleanor Maccabee, and I remember, and I may get the age a little wrong, but even if you put kids in, like, you shave their heads and put them in white shirts and give no sex markers, I think it's about 2.5, they already are able to notice what's the sex of the other kid. I mean, it is a thing that becomes programmed into children really early, and it will be noticed by them, and it's just sort of a part of naturally growing up, and only now are we sort of introducing confusion into this. But anyway, I think that's one thing that for sure it's nice to have an early conversation about there's two sexes and they exist and you'll notice them. And if anyone says anything different, let me know, and let me know what you saw and what they're talking about, and we'll have a talk about it.
It's interesting because I would say it's not even programmed into kids to see the difference between sex, because it seems to be a very, very human thing. That if you spend a lot of time with kids, you notice that the things that they notice are the difference between adults and children. So you go into a room where there's a child somewhere over there, and they're instantly drawn to the child, or knowing the difference between men and women. And it's so interesting if you go back and you look at, say, some of the like the Cordelia Fine Delusions of Gender book, where she writes about, amongst other things, stereotype threat. And one of the interesting things points that she makes is that it is so difficult to research the differences in sex between infants, because if there's any clue at all, the observer will observe something different depending on, whether they think that this is a girl or a boy, which seems to suggest to me that it's evolved for a purpose. And maybe even, there's the obvious thing about finding a mate, but it also seems to be something about helping kids to adjust to their adult bodies. And so when we mess with that, when adults become involved in contradicting that, then you can see why it would have unintended consequences.
Yeah, I'll just add that the title to Eleanor Maccabee's book is something like Growing Up Apart, Coming Together. And the research shows that for the most part, boys and girls, when they're little, they get along and they talk and stuff. But for the most part, the boys will go socialize with the boys and the girls will go socialize with the girls. And that will happen organically and naturally without anyone telling them to do that. This is just a thing of natural sorting of kids and obviously there's a spectrum, and this is not 100%, but it is a natural phenomenon that is clearly like evolved and ingrained in kids. They notice these things and it affects their socialization.
Mm.
Not just us, other primates. So I don't know, the monkeys, the boy monkeys and the girl monkeys, they do different. They have different, right? More roll-ins, rough and tumble play. One more stays home. There's a crossover, but it is just a reality that can be, it's readily observable.
I think that's true. It seems pretty clear that this is everywhere, but if a parent wanted to find out exactly what is happening in their school, do you have any advice on that? I mean, how would you know?
Well, I mean, first of all, you want to develop relationships with your school, with your teachers, with your principal. I think that, personally for me, I prefer to have face-to-face interactions. I think it makes it, gives an opportunity to share knowledge and develop a rapport and trust. So personally, I would maybe start with the principal and ask what policies they have in place. Like, do they ask the children for their pronouns? Is that a school-wide policy? I mean, I've also found that in some schools, different teachers do different things. It's also important to talk to your teacher and kind of like touch every different layer, right? So the teachers, the principals, look at your city and state, gender and sex ed guidelines. New York State just had an update to theirs recently, and there's potentially more coming down the pipeline. So I think there's that as well. But for me personally, I've always reached out to the people touching my kids directly to find out, what changed this year, what should I be aware of, and then have a list of specific questions from the pronouns and onward.
That makes a lot of sense. So you were saying that, and we've had so many conversations because I interviewed you, but you were saying that you were talking about inoculation, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about different ways that you can use the toolkit.
Well, I think that, first of all, I think the toolkit is really a great conversation starter. I think everybody needs to be inoculated. I mean, definitely our children, and those are the ones we have the authority over and the strongest relationships and responsibilities for. So it all begins in the home. And there are images in the toolkit and terms that we can certainly share with younger children. There are graphics from I Am Jazz, which is commonly read now. Kris brings up really great points about sharing not just what is taught in schools, but also explaining biological reality, because now we can't rely on the school to do it. So I think parents need to reassert their responsibility. I mean, just as an anecdote to that, on the first day of sixth grade, my middle schooler at the time came home and told me that they were asked for their pronouns. And she just thought it was weird. And, I don't know if she even gave any pronouns. She just kind of tried to pass it over really quickly. But by seventh grade, they were being taught comprehensive sex ed, and they were no longer using the terms girls and boys, but AFABs and AMABs. And I had never heard that before. I just like, what is it? AFAB? It's like assigned female at birth, assigned male at birth. So imagine now if you've never inoculated your child and talked about biological reality, and all of the literature and the teachings are curated in this way, how would they know any different? So I guess that's the process of inoculation. So when that comes along, my daughter came home and was like, this is ridiculous. That teacher's so weird. But I don't know. I mean, how many of the other kids in that class went home and said the same thing? If they didn't say the same thing, and if they didn't talk to their parents, and if they didn't explore these concepts more, what did that leave them with for the duration of seventh grade? And how did it impact their identities? I think that's really scary.
Yeah. And can I just say, I mean, there's no reason that 6th and 7th graders need to be giving pronouns. They just don't. Right. It just doesn't make any sense. And so I think that, explaining to your child that this is not a appropriate way for us to sort of be raising kids, and they don't need to, we can, if someone has an issue that's a mental health issue and they have some problem with gender distress, they can go talk to a therapist, but in a school, they should still be addressed by their biological sex and their name. It just seems total common sense. They're still in a period of development. They have plenty of time to grow up and figure out, what they will be as an adult. If they want to, and once again, we're also not like, I think part of what is important about the toolkit, we're for a very sensitive handling of gender non-conforming kids. There's lots of kids that really struggle if they're a girlish boy or a boyish girl, or they're not comfortable in themselves. We want them to get help, and we want them to be supported. But none of that means that they need to adopt a different pronoun. None of that means that they need to change their name. That's not the solution to their distress. That's not going to help them feel more comfortable and get themselves through. And it is hard if you're gender non-conforming, a boyish girl or a girlish boy, where you have some feelings that are gay or, non-dominant. This is going to be something that can be distressing and hard on kids. And they do need support and help. And I don't want to come off as thinking that there's not a a really challenging situation for some kids. And then you throw on top of that so many of the kids that are distressed are either have gone through trauma, they have autism, they're depressed, they're anxious, they have, so the kids you see that are having gender distress often are having real trouble getting their needs met, and they're struggling. And so I do want those kids to be supported. I just feel like we are going down a very unwise pathway in terms of how to support those kids. I'd also say that there's a bit of this pronoun thing that is really a power struggle, right? And kids want to insert themselves and they want to show that I'm going to force you to say this or that or whatever. And I think that by playing along and sort of giving in on this, people may seem like it's harmless, but I'm like, let's find a more appropriate way for kids to exert power and to have agency in the world and do something with their energy and with their creativity. Pronouns and this, it just seems to be a very non-functional way for kids to be doing that. And they seem to be sort of siphoning, like I said, mostly really troubled kids down a pathway that's really not going to work out for them. So, once again, I think all those, having that conversation and, knowing your kid and knowing their school environment will help inoculate them for whatever they handle. We always also in mental health want to be like, hey, you can do it. This is not the hardest challenge human beings have ever faced. Whatever you're going to go through in school in America in 2024 is really, very mild compared to lots of things the species has a handle in the past. You can do it. Let's not take this stuff too seriously, but let's take it seriously enough where we don't go down any roads that are just going to be counterproductive. So I think those type of messages help inoculate a kid for whatever they're going to get.
And provide the framing in the home. I mean, we need to, again, like I keep talking about this, like take it home, bring it home, and the parents need to feel confident that they know enough to be able to help their child, and that these experts, these shills who are like parading as, the ultimate authorities actually, have an agenda, and parents have an agenda. That's their child, right? I mean, and it is complicated because you may say all the right things, and then there is, I have friends who have told me they're a little bit at a loss because they have two young girls who are in elementary school, and a family member who was formerly, I believe, a woman is now, saying that they're a man and they're dressing as a man. They're a cousin, they're beloved, they're respected. This is a really difficult situation. It kind of points to the fact that families really need to feel, like hunker down, love their kids, but also, kind of explain things in biological terms, and also, of course, teach their kids acceptance, because nobody wants to see somebody else discriminate against. And I don't know, Kris, how would you address a family that came to you? Because I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not an expert. I have to say, like when this situation came up, I was a little bit at a loss, like how to handle that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think for one, even if you were sort of lamenting the fact that we feel like there's a lot of people who are unwisely, socially or medically transitioning, it is a fact and it is happening. And we don't need to condemn people or give them a hard time. We do want to support, although I would be clear to my kids that I still think that there's a sex binary. You're either a boy or a girl. We want you to fully grow up. If ever there was some consideration of any kind of medicalization or anything, that's only a thing that, from my perspective or this family's perspective, that would occur well into adulthood and is not a kind of a decision that is appropriate for a child. If some people do make a decision that is contrary to, what your family would suggest or what your values are or what you think is wise, that's just like other decisions that other families are always making all the time. And, we interact with people who are doing things differently, and that's their, prerogative to do this. It is a, I'm coming at it because I have sort of two different hats on. I'm trying to answer what I would say as a family member, but I'm also professional. And once someone has made a transition and that's the way they're going in life, I want their life to work out well and I want to support them and I hope the best for them and I don't have any negative feelings towards anyone. I do think, though, it's wise to be cautious and to urge caution and to say that we're not going to, that as a professional, that I'm not going to support youth being transitioned because there just doesn't seem to be an evidence base and it seems to be a very radical intervention for something that probably is more likely to be a developmental identity crisis than a lifelong, transgender identification. So I have, both ways that I would talk about it in the clinic, and you have suggestions for parents about how they would handle it. I think it does often come down to how much you want to take a stand on something too. I think, we can say it's easy to, we're kind of putting ourselves out there in the public and are willing to take a stand, and we may take heed for that, but that's, we're adults and that we've made that choice. Not everyone is in the same situation that we are in, and they may or may not be able to take as public of a stand as they would like to on things. And so I think that can complicate also depending on what your environment is around you. Because in that same scenario, there may be some pressure to agree with or support something that you don't really believe in or you don't think is wise, and to go along with using language or pronouns or whatever that you think is inappropriate. And I think, everyone has to kind of decide for themselves where they're going to land on all those things. It's unfortunate that we've gotten into kind of a crazy place with regard to these things. But I don't think it's easy. I think it can be very complex and difficult, like you're saying, and everyone's going to have to decide for themselves at the end of the day.
Well, part of the problem is that it has always been, it's always been tough to be a teen, and it is a time when you're playing around with different identities. It seems to me, though, that a big part of the problem is that adults are becoming involved in this realm that used to be sort of a youth culture. And so I don't know about you, but I can definitely remember, we had eccentric kids who had changed their names or only wore a purple hat or did whatever it was that they were doing to play around with identity. And the stakes are so much higher now because, like you say, it's a power struggle. Now the school has to support the pronouns and the kids potentially have to go along with the pronouns, and they change from day to day. And there is a real danger because the stakes are so high now, because it's not just that you can play around and try on these different persona because they want to medicalize it, which is very, very different than it's been in the past.
I just say you're not the only person. I mean, this comes up constantly that it used to be that kids would adopt a emo or goth or some other kind of a presentation which would express themselves and reject parental authority and let them be creative and go into their own subculture that, rejects, adult subculture. I mean, we've had different ways that people have been able to do this without adult, kind of supporting it in a medicalized way. I mean, it seems very troubling that some people don't get it, that the adults are now leading a youth subculture in some ways and leading it in a non-healthy way. It just seems, so it'd be like, let the kids work the stuff out themselves, let them grow up. We've had youth subcultures forever. I'm sure we will continue to have them, but we don't need to medicalize them. We don't need to throw adults in to support or deny. It should really be an organic thing coming from kids.
Yeah. And I just want to add to the inoculation question. I know one of the things we really want to do is to get this toolkit to pediatricians, because pediatricians have found themselves in difficult times as well. It's a busy job. I've seen pediatricians who don't have the time to fully research a chronic condition like eczema And it's incumbent upon the parents to almost educate the pediatrician and say, here are some other things, help me find a solution. I've had children with eczema, so that's the thing that comes to mind for me. But this can be a really useful toolkit for a pediatrician or any child, any doctor who comes in contact with children to have, because they need shortcuts. And if we don't educate them, if we don't guide them to something that's like an objective reality, the pharmaceutical companies will not spare any expense. And that's what they do. So I think what you did today with the dentist is a great idea. I would love to see it in the hands of, all of the pediatricians or anyone who, in the medical field who works with children.
I mentioned something too that I think is important to consider about how different this generation is compared to previous generations. And there's some data on this. And I think that we have to acknowledge that we've kind of failed to create a robust, strong, the group of young people that we have. Although there are lots of really strong and robust kids, there are a lot of them that are really struggling. And in some ways, we failed to raise them in a way that has caused them, and I think social media, online time, all sorts of things. But it has to go beyond that. It has to be also some things about our communities and our neighborhoods and the messages that we're giving them. But this cohort is more likely to have problems with adopting an illness identity than previous groups of kids. We used to have a lot of stigma about illness identities, and people didn't say, when I was a kid, if there were kids who were on psychiatric medicines, I didn't know it. Nobody, it was a lot less, but people didn't really talk about it. And I think we were, overly stigmatizing in a number of ways before. But now we've dropped any kind of, and this is one of those things where all gender identities are okay and it's perfectly fine, whatever you want to choose, and we think it's all great. I mean, gender dysphoria is a DSM diagnosis. Is a disorder. We're seen to be forgetting the fact that we shouldn't be really celebrating disorders and problems, and we don't want kids to associate with any of these labels that we give them: autism, ADHD, depression, gender dysphoria. We don't want that illness association. We want them building a strengths-based life and going out and being robust and taking chances and taking positive risks and doing things. And so I think part of why the toolkit for one is a bit of a reality check that, in this generation at this time, we actually do need some counterweights to some of the stuff that's going on with our kids. There is some problems, and that we need to be honest and address these. And this is just one aspect of it. It's an important one, but I think it does speak to this generation's overly, not their needs not getting met, and them finding illness identities more than they really need to.
I think that's right. And I mean, so much of it is posed in terms of identity, but if you don't have any constants, then your identity can't be stable, which is why it's so frustrating to see little kids who the very first thing that about yourself is your sex. And I'm actually surprised that there aren't more kids who are, and maybe they're traumatized by this, because I have, in my own life, I've seen little kids who, someone calls a little boy a girl and he's really upset because that's the one thing that he knows about himself. And so how can you form a stable identity if, you can be anything? If you can be, male, female, furry, and it's just incredibly unfair to this generation. So I have got some questions from people who have tuned in that maybe we could start to look at some of these. I've got one here which is about the medical organizations, and I presume they're talking about the American Academy of Pediatrics, but I'm sure there are the psychological associations as well, whose names I can never get straight because they're all AAP, PA. So we've got a question about how the positions of medical organizations are being challenged to prevent harm to children through gender confusion, and I suppose whether the toolkit can play a part in challenging some of those things.
Well, I'll lead and say, I think what has happened is that a small group of people within these organizations have really leveraged some sort of moral claims and taboos, and really have pushed us. And I'm a member of the American Psychiatric Association and American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and some other ones, but I talk with members, they don't agree with a lot of this. So I think there is a big but silent majority of clinicians who think that, especially when you talk about puberty blockers and youth medicine, that think it's, poor care and not appropriate. But unfortunately, the professional organizations have dug in with their stance. They took these stances long ago, well before you could have ever said that there's any kind of strong evidence base for it. So it was clearly a ideological stance that they took. And now they seem not to want to give up that because they're embarrassed, and they've, probably have done harm, and maybe it'll make them susceptible to lawsuits and other stuff if they were honest about their, the mistakes they'd made. But I don't know. I've pushed really hard, but I don't see them changing. And I see some, digging in with some of the stuff. For the American Psychiatric Association, when I get emails about postpartum pregnancy, they say birthing people. They don't say mothers. This is, to me, it just seems insane, right? You're going to really put birthing people on things that you're putting out in the world? You want people to take you seriously? It just seems wackadoodle. So, yes, I think that in professional organizations have, in some ways, left it. And that's why GenSpect is, a strong organization. That's fulfilling a need that we have. And this is why Restore Childhood and, Therapy First and other things are growing in the dysfunction of these old organizations, which are obviously leading us astray. We need new organizations that are more functional. But I wish I had something more positive to say. There's a lot of us trying, and maybe someday things will change there.
Let's hope. So here's another question. Someone is wondering how school staff have responded to the toolkit. Have you had any feedback from schools about this?
We just released it at the end of June after school let out. So not yet, but I would love to get back to you on that. And we're definitely working on trying to get broader, access to this toolkit. And, what we have on the website, it's expensive. Like the toolkit is like 46 pages, and it's color. It's an expensive thing to print. And we realize that not everybody is going to be able to print it. But we have printables on gendertoolkit.com, and you can print little like palm cards. You can print a postcard. You could print a flyer that has the school to clinic pipeline. It's a very pretty graphic. It's not a pretty pathway, but a pretty graphic. And you can share those with teachers and with admin, and even leave them on the playground and see. There's a QR code on each one. People can go and see for themselves. But the toolkit is extremely, pleasant and non-adversarial. We really tried not to editorialize too much. Kris has been an incredible voice of reason, and we've presented the evidence, the terminology, the resources, and really tried to empower parents and administrators and anyone who deals with kids to make better decisions and better informed decisions.
I also was wondering, this is not a question from the audience, but one of the points that people have made to me is that the courts will just take the information that activists give them, and they will base their decisions on what they find in the activist materials. And it strikes me that one of the great things about the toolkit is that it's incredibly easy to understand. It's constantly being updated. The data is all there, and I'm wondering if the courts might be a place to to try and introduce the toolkit for justices who are trying to learn about what they might be dealing with in this area.
What do you think, Kris? Because you do a lot of...
Well, I've been in court on these issues, so yeah, you're correctly identifying that the activists have been really, and they did seem to have very deep pockets, and they are very aggressive about training judges, about trying to set up these dynamics where this is, in these, even if it's small cases, they want to win precedent so they can get things established. So yes, I do think this would be a nice thing for a counterweight in the courtroom, because it does lay things out in a way that helps people understand. I mean, honestly, if you start to look into this issue and you're faced with a 50-page text document that you're supposed to read, and lawyers and the judges, they are faced with it. They do really. I mean, it's amazing the job they do. They actually read a lot, and I've been very impressed by some of the judges, how much stuff they have to get through just for one case, hundreds of pages of expert reports and stuff. So yeah, this presentation is so nice. It's laid out, it's color, it has the links. So in terms of educating people in the courtroom, I think it's a valuable tool. I think it actually could be very useful. And probably that is one of the nice uses of this, is that because of the complexity of the material, because of all the things going on, and there are a lot of schools-based cases going on. I mean, you can imagine all over America, this has opened up all sorts of lawsuits on from every direction. So yes, I think that it's a nice tool, and it probably will end up being looked at. I'm sure next time I'm testifying on a school case, it may be brought up on the other side. They may say, try to find something, but I welcome people trying to find something. If there's something wrong in there, I'd like to correct it. If there's something that's non-scientific, we'll make it scientific and make it better, because we didn't create something where we're pushing ideology. We're trying to have a facts-based, strong advocacy for for a proper look at these issues in schools.
Makes sense to me. So I've got another question here about kids with ADHD, and the point the person is making is that if it's schools will say that a child with ADHD is uncontrollable and needs to be medicated, and it seems to be a gateway to sort of separating kids off from their parents. Is there anything in the toolkit about that? I mean, I've read most of it, but not specifically about ADHD, but about how to deal with schools who are intent on medicalizing everything about your kid.
Natalya, I don't think there's anything on ADHD in particular, or about the tendency for those kids who have already started to get psychiatric treatment and already have been medicalized in some ways in terms of their mental health, as being the same kids that maybe are more, for some way, open to a medical pathway, because they're already used to taking pills to change things in them. And I think that I'm sensing from that question that this is a parent who's somewhat frustrated by the school's quickness to want to medicalize whatever's going on in school, rather than taking a more holistic approach at whatever behavior or focus or other issue that the school is having. Because, at the end of the day, it is a parent's choice whether or not they want to put a kid on medicine or not. And it's perfectly fine. It's not it is very reasonable for a parent, if they've done their homework and they look at it and they decide not to medicate, that is a choice that's perfectly reasonable. And there's lots of parents who are great parents who don't feel that medication is a good choice for their kid, and they have all the right in the world to do that. But yes, sometimes I see some pressure that's quite inappropriate put on from the schools. It's not all the time or a lot, but I think it's not so much pressure, but it is sometimes the teachers are being overtaught, I think, on these very simple concepts like ADHD, and so they think in those terms probably more than they really should. And you'll probably notice that there's lots of places in the world, well, every single other place in the world, medicates their kids less than us, and a lot of them get really good results. So somehow that you can make a system with less medicalization and really good results.
You got to give kids more than 15 minutes a day for recess and more than 15 minutes a day for lunch. You got to serve them real food for lunch, not packaged, grilled cheese that's cooked in the plastic that has endocrine disruptors in it. I mean, I could go on, but we're not setting kids up for success. We're not setting families up for success. That's not how things are working. And so, my heart goes out to parents who are on that medicalization path for ADHD. I don't think that, Kris, you can correct me, but I don't think medicalizing for ADHD is a gateway to transition or anything like that, right? I mean,
I wouldn't say that it was. And I would also say, I medicate. I have lots of kids that I treat for ADHD, and severe ADHD is very varying, and it's a thing that we should take seriously. And I think it's reasonable for a kid with severe. I just see lots of kids who are called ADHD, and they look very normal to me. So I think that this is this has occurred in our world. Kids with ADHD are more likely to get the gender dysphoria diagnosis. So there is some connection there. And I think it'd be nice to get more data about it and see if, our kids who are being medicated for one thing, then also more likely to go on and, become medicalized for gender dysphoria. I don't really have the data, but I do think if you look at the surveys that it is more often kids with ADHD. Is it related to them just getting a psychiatric label? Is it related to them getting medical treatment for ADHD? Or is it that they're kids who struggle and have problems and are not getting their needs met, and then therefore, the transgender identity or non-binary identity is more appealing to them or more likely to occur in that situation? Or is there some primary other issue going on, like you were saying, endocrine disruptors or anything else that could affect two things at one time? I think all those are possible, and we really don't have other than the fact it's more common in kids diagnosed with ADHD, we don't really have an answer.
Yeah, and I keep thinking about the fact that if Teddy Roosevelt was alive today, or Winston Churchill, there is no question they would have been put on stimulants, because neither of them did great in school. They couldn't sit still. They needed to move. Teddy Roosevelt, out in the woods, and Churchill with his soldiers and completely flunking out of school. I mean, we're pathologizing a lot of things that make us great. So we need to be careful about that.
Well, back in the illness identity, and if the kid gets to see themselves or starts to see themselves, it's not even an illness identity. It's I don't function well, or I have problems. There's this whole idea of Matthew effects. And the kids that have more problems see themselves as more troubled and then tend to underachieve down the road, even if they would not have otherwise without the initial struggle. And so, yeah, that is part of what we deal with in mental health, and we're trying to minimize that, not cause it to be worse. But sometimes I think we do things that make things worse.
It strikes me that there's an aspect of this which is looking for off-the-shelf solutions. It's almost like a kind of consumerism. It's like, well, this identity doesn't suit me, so I'll try pansexual for a while, or I'll try, I see my problem is that I have ADHD, or that I have borderline personality, and, all of these things which are bandied around. And they're just, it's just, there's something about having lost the idea that an identity, a life is an achievement, and that it's going through the experiences that will allow you to be able to become the kind of, master of your own destiny, which unfortunately we are missing. So we're just down to the last couple of minutes. Is there anything you feel like you want to add? Anything that you feel like we've left out? Anything you'd love to see a year from now with the toolkit?
Well, Nancy, I'll throw in that I liked your last comment, and I agree about this. Identity we're so individualistic today that we're like, I can declare my own identity or whatever. It's like, no, this is not how people need to earn an identity through, life. It's a shared thing. So it's not just something that us as individuals make. And about the toolkit, my final comments will be, I would really like anyone who's viewing this to just have a look at it and decide for yourself what type of a document this is and come to see what it is, because I do think it has many uses and will be very useful in schools, but it's a nice way to educate yourself just on this topic in general, because it's so well put together and easy to read, and with all the links, it's a really nice document.
Yeah, and you may stop yourself if you're in the position of power or authority, either in medicine or education, from causing something that I'd never heard of before until I read Abigail Schreier's book, iatrogenic harm, right? Where the treatment actually causes the harm. Like, we're practicing this radical empathy for all sorts of people, for, gender nonconformity, name it. Like, we're trying to accept and welcome everyone and be inclusive, which is wonderful. And there's no harm in being nice and kind to everyone, but we need to also think about, what we're doing to achieve those goals. And if, maybe some of the things need to be reexamined. And when it comes to the toolkit, what I'd like to see in a year is for the toolkit to be completely forgotten and useless, because none of it would exist anymore, because ultimately it's here to help families and stop the harm. But, if it ends and if these institutions walk it back, then maybe it won't be needed. Until then, it's here.
That's brilliant. So same time next year, hopefully we won't have anything to talk about. But thank you both so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. And thank you for putting together such an excellent toolkit. The links are in the chat. When we post this, you'll be able to well, then there's the link right there. You'll be able to find plenty of ways to get to the toolkit. So thank you for making it, and thank you for coming on to talk to us today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Okay. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.